I'd like to talk now about steps in historical research. What are the initial steps that we take and how do we build upon them? The first step is to begin the very important task of background reading. As I mentioned in another video, it's a temptation for students to want to read only as much as they need to write the paper they want to write. And in doing so, they cheat themselves of the value of really understanding the topic and the field they're writing on before they go further. So reading voraciously, not yet trying to nail down a narrow topic, not trying yet to, in your mind, construct a paper, but thinking about the topic, thinking about the era, thinking about the issues that are involved. Reading widely at first. Become acquainted with the general subject before you attempt to think about how you're going to write a paper on it. Now, I know this takes time, and it's difficult to do within the confines of a semester-long class, but this is the way to do reading, and it's something that you could work on if you know something about the class that's coming up even before the class begins. But this is the way to do research. So get the lay of the land. Don't move too quickly into writing the paper. Now, once you have a good handle on your topic and on not only what happened, but what historians say about what happened. You know, you can get the first part from Wikipedia. Wikipedia is not an appropriate source for research, nor is the Encyclopedia Britannica for that reason. They're what are called tertiary sources. We have primary sources and secondary sources. Encyclopedias are tertiary because they are not making any effort to do original research or even talk about original research. They're talking about secondary sources. So, but they can give you a good handle on the basic names and dates and places so that you understand what happened or what are interesting topics. You might get an idea on interesting topics within that era. But you need to quickly move beyond that. So once you have a good handle on the issues, but also in the topic, but also secondly a good handle on what historians are saying about that topic, and that's part of your broad reading to see the kinds of questions, the kinds of struggles that historians are having. Because when you pick a topic for your paper, you want to pick a topic that other historians have wrestled with before. You don't want to try to pick something that no historian's ever written on, as far as you know. It is difficult to do unless you just haven't found the sources. But in any case, you don't want to do that because you aren't going to have much help in actually writing your paper from the work of other scholars. And it also will likely turn out that the reason that no one else has written on the topic is that there's not enough evidence, there's not enough sources, there's not enough to work with to write an appropriate paper. So in your broad reading, you're going to be looking for the work of scholars who have talked about their investigation of your topic, of your era at least, and show you what kinds of solutions they've come up with. And so from those, you can begin to think, oh, I would be really interested in pursuing this further. So focus your reading now more narrowly and deeply. Gradually moving from broader reading to more focused reading. As you say, this is an interesting topic, it interests me, but also it looks to me like enough has been done on this topic that I'm going to have something to work with. I'm going to have evidence and the examples of other historians to work with. So as you read more and more narrowly, think as you read. Don't get stuck in information acquisition mode, as I call it. That is just taking in information. Oh, that's interesting, that's interesting, that's interesting. Instead, begin thinking more and more what you might be able to do with that information, or what you're reading make sense? Does it fit with what you know of the world around you? Process the information, think about it, and this will help you move towards coming up with your own topic. As you are interacting and perhaps arguing with the works that you're reading, you may develop some provisional arguments, some early arguments that you think, no, I don't think that's what's going on. I don't think that's why this happened. I think it was more this. So as you read, consider whether your provisional arguments make sense. Now, you want to begin reading journal articles at this point if you haven't read them already. In order to get a broad sense of the field, you're going to want to read books because they are by nature broader, especially books that are written for a more popular audience. I'll talk in a minute about the difference between those, but between that and scholarly books. But those books are written to introduce people to a topic, and so they're going to be more comprehensive, more of an overview, and that's great. It's not a good example of how you want to write your paper. It's not research. It's really a reporting on research that's already been done in that kind of a book. But it's very useful when you're doing the broad reading. But now you want to move into more targeted reading, and so you want to read journal articles on your topic that are very focused and narrow, will give you a good idea of how to write the kind of paper, how to construct a 15 to 25 page paper, let's say, and how to put together your arguments and all of that, as well as giving you evidence that you'll be able to use eventually in your paper. So now once you have narrowed your reading, you've developed a topic, you know what you want to investigate, you have some ideas of the approach you want to take, now it's time, thirdly, to develop a thesis statement. This is your answer to your work's big question, the solution to your topic, your issue's main problem. Solution to a problem, answer to a question. That's the thesis. It's an argument. It needs to be debatable. It needs to be something that readers could disagree with. Otherwise, there's no reason to write it. It's just you're restating information from other sources. Just tell people to go read those sources and don't bother writing a paper. So you need to be injecting yourself in some way into your paper, and that's what your thesis represents. It's a working hypothesis. It'll be revised almost certainly before you're done writing the paper. It's a place to start. So don't worry if you find that you're having to change it as you go along. That's natural. That's normal. The focus of your thesis needs to be more narrow than you think at this point. I find this invariably with students, even outstanding students, that the thesis they start with is broader than they need it to be. When I've mentored 50-page master's thesis in this program in the past, most of the students start with a thesis that's way too broad. It can't be accomplished in 50 pages. They would need 200 or 300 pages. So they need to think about how to focus and narrow. Students want to be comprehensive. They want to be earth-shattering in a thesis that they present. But historians understand we have to proceed carefully and be very careful in our handling of history. So at this point, once you have a thesis, you can develop a tentative outline. This is basically how the parts of your paper this is so that you can see for yourself how the parts of your paper will all serve to accomplish the task of proving your thesis. You want the parts of the outline to represent a logical flow of the paper. You want it to show that you are proceeding from an initial good starting point, and then you're building upon that in each section of the paper to ultimately prove the thesis. So every part of your paper, except for the introduction itself and the conclusion, needs to contribute to supporting and proving the thesis statement. When you write your outline out, some students always write outlines, some don't like outlines. I encourage you to try writing outlines if you haven't before. And when you do this, this is a way for you to show yourself that the different parts of your paper do fit together well and that they're in the right order and they make sense. But one thing you need to do is be sure you write out the parts of the outline in complete sentences. Don't write bullet points, because a bullet point is just a statement of a topic. A complete sentence can be a mini thesis statement. So in a sense, each of your paragraphs should have its own thesis statement, apart from the intro and conclusion. That is what you're attempting to prove in that paragraph that will ultimately relate to the overall thesis of the paper. So ideally, each point in your outline should be an argument representing the argument that you're making in each paragraph or in each section of the paper. Of course, you need to assemble your sources. As you're working through your sources, be careful to take careful notes to be sure that if you want to quote something, that you write down the quote exactly, and then use it carefully in the paper, and be sure you document, of course, any use of the quotes. But key books and articles, you want to have, of course, a list of those, add to it as you see fit, delete books or articles that don't really help you in your paper. You want your paper, the bibliography or the works cited section in your paper, to represent only sources that you've actually used in the paper. You don't want to list sources that you at one time thought would be helpful but turned out to not actually use. Well, I want to talk now about the use of primary and secondary sources. I've mentioned them before, but just to be sure that we're all on the same page. A primary source is like raw data that needs to be interpreted. It might be a speech given in the era that you're studying. It could be a newspaper account from the era that you're studying. It could be, if you're studying the Civil War, letters written home by Civil War soldiers. It's, again, like raw data because it just is what it is, and you have to figure out how to interpret it, how to use it to make some kind of an argument. Secondary evidence, by contrast, is the work of others who seek to interpret primary evidence. And so, in terms of doing historical research, secondary evidence is going to come almost primarily from scholars, historians, but perhaps also other scholars of other disciplines who have studied your topic and have made judgments about it. So a combination of primary sources and secondary sources is important to balance that. We don't want to rush too quickly to studying secondary sources and end up just repeating their ideas, their theories, and not have our own idea. So it's a good idea to start by studying the primary sources and not move too quickly to secondary, to opinions of others. But at some point you do need to know what others have said about your topic so that you can then interact with them and agree, disagree, modify those sources. Now, when it comes to books, I mentioned earlier that there are popular level books, then there are more scholarly books. Scholarly books we refer to as monographs. And monographs are book-length versions of professional journal articles. In both cases, a monograph or a journal article is written by a historian for an audience of historians, and particularly for an audience of historians in that era or field or topic that he or she is addressing in the book or the article. Whereas popular level books, of course, as the name implies, are written for a more popular audience of people who have interest in history but have no expertise in the particular field or era that is being presented in that book. So both are useful, but obviously a monograph type book is more useful for doing research than a popular level book, because a monograph is going to present more arguments. It's going to more carefully document those arguments and use of documentation to prove the arguments within it. And so that's going to be more useful for you in terms of writing your own paper, as well as it's going to give you more evidence, and you'll be able to think about whether you agree with those arguments or whether you can bounce off them in some way, extend, change, modify, even deny in your thesis, the theses of other scholars. Now, how do you tell the difference between a popular level book and a monograph? Well, a popular level book may well be written by a scholar. It may be written by a historian. Many popular level history books are written by professional historians. But again, the difference is that they're written for a popular audience. So how can we tell the difference? We can't do it necessarily by the name of the author. Well, there are a number of ways that we can tell the difference. The first and most obvious is the level of documentation presented in the book. So a monograph will have footnotes. If there are footnotes at the bottom of the page, they may be a quarter to sometimes a half of the page represented in footnotes. Or if they're endnotes at the back of the page, they're a pretty good chunk of the page's footnotes. In a popular level book, scholars, even who might want to include all those notations, are not allowed to by publishers. who didn't want to spend all of that ink on sources that they imagine that most of their readers won't even pay attention to. So scholars actually have to cut sources if they're going to write for a publisher of popular level historical work. So you can tell by that. You can also tell by the bibliography at the end. A more extensive versus a bibliography in a popular level book tends to be more samples of the kinds of sources that you might look at to explore the topic further, but not meant to be comprehensive. Also, you can tell to some extent, this is a little harder, but if you read the introduction and maybe the first chapter, in a monograph, it's going to be very clear what the author's trying to prove, that he or she is writing this work to make an argument or a series of arguments against positions of others that they disagree with. In a popular level book, it will introduce itself more as an exploration of a topic that will ask questions, that will expose you to a variety of interesting issues, but without a clear statement of a thesis or of an argumentative direction.